Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to the program this evening. Tonight, we will hear about a remarkable Civil War hero, Stephen Atkins Swails, who became the first African-American commissioned as a combat officer in the United States military. His career in South Carolina after the war was perhaps even more remarkable, but after his death, his legacy was largely erased. Gordon Rhea will be speaking on his new book, Stephen A. Swails, Black Freedom Fighter, which helped to resurrect the reputation of Swails. Mr. Rhea is an attorney with a long and respected career, as well as an avid historian of the American Civil War. He is considered a foremost expert on the Overland Campaign and is the author of numerous books and articles on the battles of Cold Harbor, North Anna, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and the Wilderness. He earned his undergraduate degree in history from Indiana University, a master's degree in American history from Harvard University, and his law degree from Stanford University Law School. He'll be joined in conversation by Kevin Levin. Mr. Levin is an educator and historian whose research is focused primarily on the Civil War and with a concentration on Civil War memory. He has written or edited 3 books, including most recently, Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's Most Persistent Myth, which he spoke at MHS about in September of 2019, back when we actually did things in person. He earned his undergraduate degrees in history and philosophy from William Patterson University, and then a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Maryland at College Park, and a master's degree in history from the University of Richmond. Before we get started, I'd just like to mention that MHS hosts 60 original programs a year on all aspects of American history, as well as 35 seminars and teacher workshops. Most of these are free or with a small price. However, we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, but are not yet a member of MHS, I hope you will join us for future events, and I hope you will become a supporter of our work. I also hope that you'll buy a copy of this very, very interesting book. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Gordon and Kevin, who are going to take the conversation from here, beginning, I believe, with a short introduction from Mr. Rhea.
I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about how this book came about, because people are always ask me, how did you ever get into this in the first place? There's a little town in South Carolina called Kingstree that I'm sure no one in Massachusetts has heard of, and actually a lot of people in South Carolina haven't heard of it either. It's in the center part of the state. And back in about 1978, in the fall, there were 2 brothers who were in their pickup truck going out to do some fishing, and they drove by a lot that was being cleared, and on the edge of the lot was a trunk. And it kind of caught their attention. They drove down a bit, then turned around and came back, and the trunk was gone. Turned up, it had been picked up by a dump truck that was taking it to the dump to destroy it along with other trash. Later in the day, one of those brothers drove by the dump, and lo and behold, there was a trunk, and he jumped out to take a look at it, opened it up, and there were all of these old papers dating from Civil War, Reconstruction days. And he realized they might have some value, so he took them over to the local historical society in Kingstree, and lo and behold, was able to sell them to the historical society for about $75. An attorney was working with the historical society. His name is Billy Jenkinson, and he had a deep interest in history, and he decided to donate these papers to the University of South Carolina. First, he copied them, then turned them over to the University of South Carolina, which I'm told by people there, now they can't find them, but Billy saved his papers. Well, turned out these were the personal papers of Stephen Atkins Swails, and are some of the few personal papers that I'm aware of that exist from African-American soldiers in the Civil War, particularly any as unusual as this man. About 3 or 4 years ago, my wife, who does work as a guardian ad litem, turned out she had one of her wards in Kingstree and needed to get an attorney. She knew a local lawyer here in the Charleston area where we live, who had a brother who was a lawyer in Kingstree. Turns out it was Billy Jenkinson. And she was recommended to Billy. And she got a hold of Billy and asked him if he could handle this matter for her. And he said he'd love to, but first you'd have to set up an appointment with me. So she said, okay. And he set up an appointment with me. And it turns out Billy Jenkinson had read some of my historical work, had heard some of my talks, and was interested in having me write a biography of Stephen Swails. He brought in a box of all the papers that he'd copied, and lo and behold, there they were. And I was absolutely fascinated in that book. So that's how this story finally got into print. A real lost hero of the African American community during the Civil War. So I just wanted to let you know how this all happened.
Thanks, Gordon. That was great. First, before we get started, I just wanted to say to you, thanks for the invitation to have this conversation. You could have asked any number of people, and just quite honored that you gave me this opportunity.
Well, we know each other, and I know your work very well, and I couldn't think of anybody better.
Thanks, Gordon. I wonder if we can just sort of take your introduction just a step further, because I mean, you've helped to fill this picture out just a bit in terms of how you came to this project. And as you alluded to, I think most people who know your work know you as a sort of military historian, your work on the Overland Campaign. I went back and just to remind myself how many volumes you wrote about that period between May of 1864 and June of 1864. And just in case you forgot, you wrote 5 volumes on the Overland Campaign.
I remember that, yeah.
And you've explained sort of your connection to the new project, the local connection. But I'm wondering, are there larger, I mean, in terms of your trajectory as a historian, in terms of the extent to which you might even be influenced on the broader discussions that we're having in society today about the connections between racial violence, the violence of Reconstruction. Did any of that have any influence on you to take on this project?
It did. I've had a long interest in civil rights matters. I was actually active in civil rights activities back in the 1960s when it was all getting going, and have followed the developments over the years. And I also have been very interested in biography and people in the Civil War. I did a biography several years ago, a book called Carrying the Flag, which is about a Confederate, actually out of Charleston, who ended up at 50 years old being drafted into the Confederate armies and ends up as an unsung hero. So the fact that these wars and political events like Reconstruction involved real people has always been fascinating to me. And so when I had an opportunity to actually jump into the history of African American involvement, both in the war and in Reconstruction, to me that was exciting. Also, I was interested in seeing, particularly at the end of Reconstruction, the kinds of issues that Stephen Swails had to deal with. Gerrymandering, obviously one of the first things that the new government that took over after Reconstruction wanted to do was to control voting. And of course, a lot of this resonates today in modern politics. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, let's get into the book. It's a fascinating book. I urge all of you to purchase a copy. And I do want to touch on a number of aspects of it, including some of the challenges of writing about Swails. But I want to start off, I'm sort of fascinated as someone who's writing a biography right now. I'm fascinated by the choices we make in trying to sort of frame these lives from the past. And, you start off right at the beginning with a racial riot that takes place in, I guess, Swails' hometown, Columbia, Pennsylvania. Born in Pennsylvania. And you detail some of the riots that take place in Columbia and the surrounding area of Pennsylvania, that area of Pennsylvania that he grew up in the 1830s. And I'm kind of curious as to why you chose to start in that way, how that choice actually serves as a foundation for the rest of the book.
Right. Yeah, I mean, race played a huge part in his entire life, and also racial violence played a major part in his entire life. I mean, when he was 2.5 years old, the little town of Columbia, Pennsylvania that he lived in had a huge racial riot. They were going on around the country actually in that year. I know in New York, in Philadelphia, and several other locations. And Swails' mother, again, it's interesting. We don't know his mother and his father's precise race or racial makeup. Some of the records and documents talk about both of them as being mulatto. Some say his mother was white, his father was black. He himself actually wrote a letter to the War Department when he was trying to get commissioned as an officer, and said that his mother was white and his father was 1/4 black, which made him only 1/8 black. So we don't really know, but he was always treated as a black man, and that's how he perceived himself. And in a world where racial identity was absolutely critical.
Yeah.
This huge riot in his childhood home, he never wrote about it, but there's no doubt it had to have left an impact on him. It was major. Riots, rioters going through the streets, breaking windows, really attacking the African-American part of town. And his family moved around a good bit because of that. He joins an African-American regiment, ends up being sent to South Carolina into a department of the Civil War, where the Confederate Congress and President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy had said that if you're a black man fighting for the Union and we get you, you're either going to get sold back into slavery or killed. Yeah. And that's all there is to it. And so that played a huge part in his life. And then, of course, after the war, he decided to stay in South Carolina and was involved in the Reconstruction government. And that was a task trying to bring basically citizenship and equal rights to black people.
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly things I want to get to in some detail. And I think your point is well taken, that sort of the challenge of how he sees himself in a racial context is one thing. How he's perceived, in terms of his racial identity is something else as well. But I also want to sort of touch on another point that you just alluded to, that Swails didn't write much about his early life. And, I don't mind saying that this is one of the frustrating parts of reading about Swails, because there are gaps in the historical record in terms of Swails' own writings, right? A lot of what you found apparently really does focus on sort of a little bit on the war, but a great deal on Reconstruction. And I'm wondering, just as a historian, how did you go about sort of filling in some of those gaps, especially the early years? Can you talk a little bit about that? And then I definitely want to move on to the war, but I think this is another important challenge that the biographer faces when he or she is, dealing with scant evidence.
That's right. And we know very little about his life really until he was in the 54th Massachusetts, which is after he's basically 31 years old. Yeah. His early years, we can only talk about where he was and what was going on there, and which is what I tried to do. And I tried to put him into those contexts. So when the rioters are marching into the African-American part of town and breaking windows and firing off their guns, I have him sort of huddling down in his house along with everybody else. And I think that's all you can do as a biographer, because he was right there and in the middle of it. Yeah. Later on, obviously we have a lot of material, and when it gets to his work with the Freedmen's Bureau, that we have hundreds and hundreds of letters and things that he did that are in the National Archives. And then when he's in the South Carolina Senate, of course, with his Reconstruction legislation, we have all of those legislative records. But you're right, those early years, it's been fascinating series of exchanges also that we have, obviously, when he was fighting to get promoted in the Army and to be commissioned as an officer. And I found that to be an absolutely fascinating trail to put together.
Yeah. Absolutely. And getting to the war, I mean, we should spend some time here, because I think certainly many of the viewers that are tuning in with some understanding, some knowledge of the 54th, certainly the most famous Black regiment to be raised during the war. And I think for most people, who know something about the 54th, that understanding is certainly framed with Robert Gould Shaw at the center, right? And I think a lot of people are probably coming at this having seen the movie Glory at least once, perhaps twice, and if not more than twice. And one of the things I found so interesting about reading this biography is the way in which, focusing on someone like Swails, and certainly we have accounts, we have letters, published letters from a number of people, Emilio's post-war account of the regiment. But the Swails biography is another way in which we can sort of refocus on the 54th and decenter it, if you will, from Robert Gould Shaw. And I'm wondering, as you're putting together the chapters on the war, I'm wondering, in focusing on Swails and focusing on an African-American soldier, how does that allow us to sort of reapproach, to rethink not just the importance of the 54th and Black soldiers generally, but the kinds of events that we tend to focus on. So I'm thinking here that Shaw-centered focus, we immediately think of Battery Wagner, we think of aspects of the movie, but rarely do we think of anything sort of after mid-July 1863. So I'm wondering, again, what does Swails allow us to see again, if not for the first time in the 54th?
I think what it really shows us is obviously the impact that the 54th Massachusetts had on a lot of the African-American population, but also on how the white population perceived the African-American population with respect to how it affected the perception of Black soldiers. As I know you're very well aware of, and as I make clear in my book, when the 54th started off back there and left Boston there in May of 1863 to head down towards South Carolina, it got a very mixed send-off. A lot of people were very excited about it. A lot of people thought it was a terrible thing. I mean, here you are arming the Black population. I mean, how can we do this? I mean, it was really out of the norm. There was great doubt about how it was going to perform. I know that Shaw was very interested in having it perform very well and was really dedicated to the proposition of he was going to make this a model regiment. And turns out that he did. It fought, as you mentioned, at Battery Wagner, fought down in Florida at Lee. Those are the two biggest battles it was involved in. It won neither one of them, but yet came off looking better than any other regiment that fought in those battles. The men fought as hard as they could, as long as they could. And it really, when you read the newspaper accounts that were then starting to come out in the North and in the South, believe it or not, and I mentioned some of those as well, there's a new perception that's evolving about African Americans because of that regiment. I think that's a tremendous thing. It had a huge effect on Swails also, by the way, and made him, I think, into the person that he became, and enabled him basically to maneuver as well as he did in the Reconstruction days, because in that regiment, he obviously gained a lot of confidence. He gained the respect and support of his superiors who highly recommended him. And due to the efforts of Governor Andrew in Massachusetts and then the officers, obviously, that he worked with, he was able to become, so far as I can tell, the first African-American soldier to be commissioned as an officer in the U.S. military. It was a hard fight. And the objection that the War Department raised was that he had African blood. Yet that was ultimately surmounted mainly by the argument that, well, he may have African blood, but he looks white, and you wouldn't know it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that comes out very early. If I remember correctly, yes. The first days that he's, with the regiment in Reidsville, he is singled out. I think he's promoted to sergeant
right away.
And as you point out, it seems in part because of his complexion. I mean, obviously not to discount whatever skill level he demonstrated in those first few days.
That's true.
Do you have a sense of, I mean, you've sort of touched on this, but this whole sort of question of sort of allyship or officers, white officers as allies of Black soldiers, and that's quite often viewed from the perspective of the white officer. Do you have a sense of how Swails viewed that from his perspective, the other soldiers in the 54th?
He never left any writings about it, but I think because he was very light-skinned, he took advantage of that, and he was able to basically swim in a white world. And I'm thinking about that not only when he was in the 54th Massachusetts, and his commanding officers, of course, were all white, but after he left that, he went into the Freedmen's Bureau and sort of built on what he'd learned, I think, when he was in that regiment. That is, he had to, again, swim in a world that was controlled by white people pretty much. and ended up being very successful. And actually, when you go through his Freedmen's Bureau performance, you see that he was able to win the trust of both the white and black population that he had to work with. And he did a masterful thing. He studied law right after he got out of the military, and ended up setting up a little law firm in Kingstree. And his law partner was a white Southerner who was also Jewish, who had actually fought in the American Civil War and had been in a battle against him, and yet they became partners. So he was able to, I think, work both worlds, both the African American world and the world of the white folks.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I wonder to what extent that ability to sort of straddle both worlds, to the extent that he was able to do so, comes out of the challenge, and you touch on this during the war itself, that he's promoted in part because of his complexion, but the promotion comes with the stipulation that he can only practice it or act it, right? He can only play the role of second lieutenant when he's within the regiment itself, that he's, yeah, right. So there's limitations placed on him, even in the act of, even with the honor of being promoted during the war.
Yeah, I mean, these are baby steps, but they're steps in a good direction. And I think he saw that, and I think he was able to continually sort of bridge the gulf between the white and the black world, and to his advantage and positively, and get some good things done by doing that, and do it in a way that, you know, very few other politicians were able to do.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a very impressive man.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, readers can, you know, will obviously learn a great deal about, you know, his military exploits, and obviously Battery Wagner is a big part of that. But like as I sort of mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, the regiment continued after the failed assault at Wagner through to the end of the war in South Carolina, as well as Georgia and Florida, I believe. Any sense of, when thinking about the engagements that Swails took part in, what stands out for him? You know, is it Wagner? What has the most impact in your mind on his military experience? I mean, what is the battle? I guess this is getting back to the whole question of how getting beyond Shaw and Wagner may help us to reframe this story. What stands out for Swails?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when you mentioned Shaw. Shaw's Civil War with the 54th Massachusetts lasted less than a month. I mean, he died there at Battery Wagner, and yet the war had another year, almost a year and a half to go, and that was done without him. And Colonel Halliwell, who ended up replacing him, did a fantastic job, and I think carried on in Shaw's style, and I think that accounts a lot for the success of the regiment. He also stood behind his men, was one of the main promoters of Swails, and I think he was able to hold the cohesion of that unit as well as its spirit together. He also backed him up very much, as you're well aware, in the pay disputes that they were having. They've been promised $13 a month, and basically we're going to get $7 a month after deductions for food, and there was quite a brouhaha about that. Swails was again a step forward as a leader in that pay dispute for the black troops, but Halliwell and the white officers stood with them and actually refused pay themselves until their black compatriots got paid. So Shaw may have been gone, but that same spirit and focus that he started off with that regiment with was, I think, kept going.
Yeah, a dispute that we should point out lasted into June of 1864?
Yeah, I think even later than that, if I recall correctly. Yeah. I don't think they actually received the money until almost like the very end of the year. Yeah. I think it was voted out, maybe in June by Congress, but then the money didn't ever show up for several more months.
And here is in my mind one of the most, and again, not your fault. It's a function of just the resources that you had available as a historian. But the war, I think, we're at the sort of tail end of the war, and Swails gets married.
Yeah.
And as you point out, it's not clear whether he was married earlier, but he had two children with
by his first liaison
Sandra or
in New
Sarah
York.
Thompson back
Right.
in Elmira, New York.
Mhm.
And what is just fascinating to me is he remarries Susan Aspinall, right?
Right.
Has children with her. And as far as we can tell, that's it. There's no further contact with the wife and children, family back in
Yeah.
Elmira, New York.
Correct.
What do we do with that? How do we make sense of that? I mean, I want to push you in a certain direction in a second, but before I do, I want to get your reaction.
I've wondered about that myself. The wife in South Carolina, Ms. Aspinall, swore that she had no idea, had never been told that there ever was another wife. And there also is no proof that's ever been produced or found that he actually was married to the first woman, to Ms. Thompson. But he did have two children by her. There's no question about that. That, you know, that's the messy part of things. Exactly. Once he married, in which he actually did marry his second, we'll call her second wife, and they started having children. So far as any of us can tell, there was never any contact again with the New York part of the family.
It's fascinating, and I guess there's only, we can only speculate. I guess I was left wondering, given that his military career is confined in South Carolina. We talk quite a bit about the war defining the lives of these young men, and here we have someone, African American man, who experiences at an early age the racial violence of the North. He certainly would have experienced the discrimination of the North. Goes down to South Carolina, the belly of the beast, if you will, and certainly has every opportunity to come back to New York, Elmira, anywhere else, and pick up the pieces and move on. And he chose to stay. And I guess, I mean, is there some room to sort of suggest, at least, that the war had, to some extent, given his life a kind of meaning that perhaps it didn't have before, that this is where he saw himself as perhaps being able to make the most difference. This is where he was going to pick up the pieces.
That may be, although I don't know if that explains why he would abandon his first family. I just don't know. And he never wrote about it. And I'll tell you myself, and there's actually, the gentleman died a few months ago, but there's a gentleman, McDougall, who did some intensive research on Stephen Swails in the Elmira and Cooperstown area, and was very interested in that issue, and found a lot of the old records and, of course, pension records, whatever, and still was never really able to understand how that all came about, or why, exactly what was Swales' thinking. I don't know.
Yeah.
We can
Perhaps another box will surface.
Oh yeah, they could be floating around out there.
Yeah. You obviously have been wanting to, you've sort of been pushing toward Reconstruction, and I think in many respects this is the most fascinating part of the book, not just because we have the most documentation from Swails himself, but obviously we're talking about Reconstruction in a way in which we haven't before, given the connections with current events. He's right there at the center of it all. Let's start off, and you've alluded to this, let's start off with just a sense of what he's involved in, beginning in 1865, in terms of his political positions, his work in the Freedmen's Bureau. What's he doing at this point?
Well, when he meets Miss Espinal there in Charleston, and she was actually the daughter of a free black in South Carolina. They were married, and he had to work now. He had to get him a job because his army period was over. And he joined the Freedmen's Bureau, and because of his literacy, because of his intelligence and his leadership characteristics, he was made the top administrator for this area that Kingstree is in. It's now called Williamsburg County, South Carolina. And his job basically was to help pave the way for the massive number of freed slaves to integrate into a society, to negotiate new relationships with their employers, well, their former owners who are now employers, and just a myriad of things, schooling, everything that you can think of, food, lodging, you name it. And he just jumped right into it. And I think showed all of those skills that he had showed earlier in the Army, used them quite strongly. And we have a massive record of that at the National Archives in their Freedmen's Bureau material. And you could see his skill in getting good results and bringing. He had a lot of arbitrations. Basically, he'd bring in the landowner and the slave and have them talk it through and come up with a resolution that everybody could live with. I mean, it's did a hell of a good job. Then, when the federal government stepped in and said, "Look, we have to have a constitution here in this state that's going to ensure the freedom of the slaves and their liberty and their rights," he was quite popular, and he ran for that position to represent Williamsburg County and Kingstree in the Constitutional Convention, and was elected and played a big role there. And again, we don't have a lot from him about what he said, and there's not much in the record about what he said, but there are some articles that talk about him, and it appears that he was really a behind-the-scenes man, but was extremely active, highly respected, and then was elected as the senator for the state legislature out of that same area, as well as governor of Kingstree. So that kind of tells you that he is now really the popular man in that whole area. And then once he gets into the Senate, he's selected by his fellow senators as the Speaker pro tempore. That's the highest position basically in the state Senate. And that means that you've won over the respect of your contemporaries. And he held that position for the next basically 6 years until the end of Reconstruction. So did a heck of a job. And he was quite active in pushing a lot of the Reconstruction legislation. Involving land, involving various rights for the Black population. And of course, also became a major target for the people that wanted to end Reconstruction and sort of get as close as they could to the old system without having actual slavery.
Yeah, there's a way in which that post-war violence serves as a bookend, to this biography. Again, going back to the way you begin this, this is a man who experiences a great amount of racial violence throughout his life.
Tremendous amount. Yeah, see, fairly soon on, there was a large resurgence within the white population, and to end Reconstruction, and armed gangs started up. Some of them organized, some of them not. A lot of them built up around the old rifle clubs, and it involved targeted assassination of Black political leaders and white leaders who were on the side of the Blacks or who supported them. And it involved direct, intimidation at the polling places. I mean, it was about as brutal and overt as you can imagine. And Swails felt a lot of it. As a matter of fact, what finally drove him from the state at the end of Reconstruction, he was basically threatened that if he didn't leave within 10 days, he'd be killed. And that's after he was captured, held at gunpoint. I mean, it was a real threat.
That's right. I mean, he's traveling up north, and
yes.
he during this period, his family is threatened. They remain in South Carolina.
Yes.
While he's in Washington, D.C. at one point, he chooses to go back home. And I guess the real bookend, of course, is that final threat. I mean, he stays obviously, but happens on his front doorstep of all places, right? I mean, this violence is literally coming home to Swails and his family.
Something else about him that's interesting in this stage of his life is that he becomes not only a South Carolina political figure and a major one, but also a national figure. He was South Carolina delegate to the Republican convention that nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president, for instance, and he had audiences with the president, as well as with Hayes after Grant. And I mean, he walked on a national stage as well. And when he was driven out of South Carolina, he ended up getting a job in Washington.
That's right.
The Postal Department, Treasury Department, whatever. So he again had his reach was wide. He basically was erased after the war to a large extent as well. And very little was said about him. Whenever he came back into South Carolina, it's interesting when you go through the local papers, where I spent quite a bit of time doing that, there'd usually be a little story about him, you know, the devil Swails is back. I mean, this was in all of the papers that didn't like him, but they were keeping a close eye on him, and he generally kept a low profile, although he was involved in some of the campaigning. He was a big supporter of Robert Smalls, who was one of the famous South Carolina politicians, and actually acted as Smalls' lawyer in some litigation involving some elections.
Yeah, I guess that, well, before I even ask this question, just a reminder to those of you watching, if you do have a question, please, you can ask it in the chat, I believe, and I'll be happy to pass it on. I think there might be a few in the Q&A. I'll get to those. Well, actually, let me just, let's see. Oh, well, let's just take on a question here, just
Sure.
give people a voice here. So, one viewer is asking, is it more challenging to write a narrative piece of military history or biography?
Oh, they're both pretty tough. And, and as a matter of fact, I was reflecting on some of the similarities after listening to some of Kevin's questions. For instance, he pointed out that there were some, and correctly so, that for some parts of Swails' life, we don't really know much from him. And so all we can do is put him into a context, but not really say, here's what he thought or felt. And that's what happens when you're doing battle studies as well. You have to try to figure out what both sides were doing. And obviously you collect all the information you can. Often it's very contradictory, but often there's also areas in which there's just no material. Yeah. Usually in Civil War battles, particularly during the Overland Campaign in May and June of 1864, the vast majority of the material is Union. There's a lot less Confederate material that's available. Obviously, the Confederate armies were smaller, and it was just not a population that was as given to writing letters as the Northern population was. And also there was a survival of document problem. And so I've been criticized a few times for spending too much time talking about the Union side instead of the Confederate side, but I point out I'm trying to give them all fair shrift, but it's just one of them has a whole lot more paper than the other. So, and that happens with biographies as well.
Yeah, as we both know, you can't satisfy everyone in the Civil War community. You'll never, right?
I think all you can do is what I tried to do with my battle studies. I tried to do it with Swails and biographies as well, and that is try to lay out the evidence as clear as we can, and then make some what I hope are fair deductions from it.
Peter Drummy had a really good question, one that I have as well. Did Swails remain in any way involved with other veterans from Black regiments, the 54th or even the 55th, which was also located in South Carolina?
Mm-hmm. He did. As a matter of fact, after the war, he stayed very involved with the 54th. And there were several different times when he was requested, when they would ask him for material, recollections, and he would write them back and give them his recollections. As a matter of fact, that's how I was able to find out exactly what happened with him there at Battery Wagner, at that big battle. He ends up having scaled the last parapet of the Confederate defenses, and he's with two captains, which I think says something interesting too, because those two white captains would have been obviously two heads of two companies within the regiment, and here he is, this a black sergeant, but he's with them. And so I think they were looking at him as, I don't know if you call it an equal, but certainly on par when it came to fighting.
Yeah.
And he describes what happens with them there. They both get killed. He manages to survive, but it was a heck of a thing. And he wrote all about it. Probably the biggest thing is when the Shaw, Robert Gould Shaw's monument was erected in Boston, and there was a big ceremony for it. He was invited to come up, and he did. And he actually marched in the parade near the front of it, just behind the soldier holding up the American flag. And there's a photograph of that. You can't really make him out that well, but we know he was there from other sources. So yeah, he definitely kept up those relationships.
See, there's just another question. Oh, there's another one. Let's see. Did he apply for a federal pension?
He did, because he had been wounded at Wagner. He was badly wounded at Olustee when he was shot in the head.
Right.
And then he was wounded during Potter's raid, which was a raid into South Carolina toward the very end of the war, when he actually captured a locomotive, jumped in and basically knocked the engineer out and started running the locomotive to steal it from the Confederates. And one of the Union sharpshooters didn't realize that it was him. They thought it was still, the locomotive was still under Confederate control, and shot him in the arm. Anyway, he survives all of that.
That's worth the price of the book alone, I think.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And there were some interesting accounts of that. But anyway, yeah, he did apply for a pension, was given a pension. And also we know something about that relationship between his wife and his maybe wife from some of the pension records, because they both asserted their claims. And that's when his South Carolina wife said that she had no knowledge whatsoever that he'd ever been married before.
Yeah. So this is actually a good question. It takes me back to where I wanted to steer you in the context of Reconstruction. Can you talk more about the specific work that Swails did advancing African Americans as a senator?
Yeah, he did several things, and I spent a little bit of the book looking at him. He was very big on education, and there was a lot going on with the University of South Carolina, which was all white until Reconstruction. And he put blacks onto the board of trustees and started to increase the enrollment. And a lot of the trustees then resigned. And of course, at the end of Reconstruction, that policy was ended. He did that also with several other institutions. And I cite the statistics. I can't recall them off the top of my head, but you can see this curve just take right on off on the education level of the black population in South Carolina. He was very big on that and did a lot for funding of schools and all of those sorts of things. Also, he was involved in setting up land programs so that African Americans could actually purchase property, purchase it over time, etc. Again, at the end of Reconstruction, the Redeemers, as the anti-Reconstructionists call themselves, wanted to redeem the old ways. The Redeemers managed to get a very large percentage of those purchases defaulted. So they didn't turn out as well as they should. But I understand from some sources that South Carolina ended up with the highest level of black ownership of property after the Civil War, and it was largely in large part because of Swails' types of programs. So those were the kind of things he was involved in.
It's fascinating because as you mentioned, it's like many African Americans, or the broader story of African Americans in the Civil War for a good chunk of the 20th century, that had been lost, that had been, as you put it, erased. We're now sort of uncovering aspects of this story and enriching our understanding of the Civil War and Reconstruction. But it also served in the process of distorting Reconstruction for much of the 20th century. This idea of African Americans as being sort of ill-prepared, for governance, that racism obviously was used to justify overthrowing these governments, these Reconstruction governments. And yet, when you look at what's just how deeply involved Swails was in South Carolina politics, local and state.
Mhm.
You get the sense that there was a real moment of possibility in of all places, South Carolina, that the end of Reconstruction was not inevitable, right?
No, definitely was not.
And that to me is part of the tragedy of losing Reconstruction, but also I think sort of losing sight of people like Swails. That these guys, they gave it everything. They endured so much, only to have those stories erased from the landscape.
Yeah, and it was sort of a dual problem. I mean, one problem obviously was the rise in violence from the disaffected white population that wanted to return to the old ways and saw violence as the only way to do it. And I've often thought about why did they just so naturally turn to violence? And I think it had to do with the fact that a lot of the attitudes from the slave days still persisted. And that's what you did when black people get out of line, you beat them.
Yeah.
Or hang them or whatever, and that was carried forward. And I mean, it's brutal, but that was the sensibility they're dealing with. The other problem was that the federal government, well, initially it wasn't that supportive of the black population when it was President Johnson, but of course he soon disappeared, and then of course there was Grant, and you had a government, at least for Grant's first 4 years, it was very supportive of sending troops that tried to help police the polling places and subvert the violence. But by the end of that first administration, the federal government was getting tired of this and tired of sending money and spending money on this sort of thing. And then, of course, there was a big economic downturn in the U.S. and the politics got worse and worse. And so basically, the federal government just quit. And turned it over to the states, particularly after the Hayes-Tilden controversy. And when Hayes becomes president, basically agreeing to throw in the towel on the South. And so that really was the end of Reconstruction. Had the federal government stuck with it, and had the local white populace not been as violent, I think that a lot could have been done, particularly with people like Swails, who could work with people irrespective of their color.
There's I think this is a appropriate question given that we're sort of approaching the end, but if the Swails papers had not been saved, would anyone know about this man?
I don't know. You can put a lot of it together, as I mentioned, with the records from the Freedmen's Bureau, with the records from the South Carolina archives, from his legislative time, and he gets mentioned. Say you mentioned Louis Emilio, who did the nice
Brave Black Regiment.
Yeah, was sort of the regimental historian for the 54th. He put together a book. He mentioned Swails a few times as well, but it would have been hard to do as much on Swails, and really nothing was mentioned about his childhood and his moving around. We now know where all of that took place, and so we were able to reconstruct what it had to have been like from other records. But you wouldn't know to even make that inquiry if you didn't know something about his background.
So someone else is asking about who his contemporaries were, and certainly you mentioned Robert Smalls. But I'm wondering, just as another way of getting at this question, in the course of your research, did you come across anyone who you said, you know what, that guy also, or that woman also needs a biography?
Congressman Rainey, I think, definitely needs a biography. Rainey was, I think, the very first African American ever to be elected to Congress. He was out of South Carolina and out of that same bunch.
Yeah. So I believe, I think a collection of his speeches, other writings have been published in recent years.
And there's some articles out there on him, but I think he was in Georgetown, South Carolina, and is a major figure. And I think he definitely deserves a good full book-length biography. Of course, Smalls has already gotten a lot of attention. Robert Smalls, with his capture of the boat, The Planter, and then of course his congressional run. Those are really the two other African Americans that stand out in my mind, just sitting here right now. Interesting bunch of people that he had to deal with, governors, Governor Moses, Governor Chamberlain, whatever. I mean, those are all interesting folks, and there's some things that have been done on them. But, on the African American side, no one right now comes to mind.
Okay. But was he ever tempted to move out of the United States? I don't remember reading that in your book, but
no,
he was committed.
No, he never said a word about it.
Yeah.
And he didn't seem to be that kind of guy. Whenever there was a challenge, he was the kind of person that would go after it. And that's what he lived, really, were challenges. I mean, to be with the first major African American regiment raised in the North, to fight in those battles, even though knowing that if you got caught, you were going to be enslaved or killed. And that did happen, by the way, to a lot. And then, of course, to decide to get into politics in probably the nastiest place you could imagine at that time, South Carolina, which was obviously the seat of the rebellion.
Yeah.
And says a lot about the nature of the man. He saw huge problems and went at them.
I believe you mentioned, you do mention there is a historical marker that was recently dedicated in Kingstree. Is that right?
Right.
I guess
right at the side of his former home there, which no longer exists. I mentioned Billy Jenkinson, that attorney that got me those papers. Billy was instrumental in that as well. Billy's very interested in local history. Learned about Swails, got very much into him, and not only masterminded that historical marker that's there, but also they located the site of Swails's grave, and Billy raised the money to get a big marker put there, and the marker was erected, and there was a big ceremony for it here in Charleston. And finally, this happened just in the last couple of weeks. Billy Jenkinson had gotten the South Carolina Senate to actually commission a portrait of Swails to hang in the Senate. They agreed to do it, but then didn't do it. And it had never happened until 2 weeks ago. It was just hung. And it may have, Billy thinks this probably has to do with the advanced publicity that started from this book. But,
Oh, interesting. I guess I'm asking because
I would feel happy and proud if that's the case. But.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Take the credit. I guess I'm asking because, as you know, we are in the midst of a pretty divisive debate about monuments, and certainly South Carolina is no stranger to this conversation, this debate. And I guess I'm wondering, is a portrait as a historical marker enough? Should South Carolina be thinking about some kind of statue? If so, where would you like to see it dedicated?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't even begun to think about that one. I think it's definitely appropriate to hang his picture in the Senate. I mean, he should be there with any of the other speaker pro tems and other major Senate figures, because he was one in his time. He was a major figure there in the Senate, major political figure in South Carolina. Whether we need a statue of him riding a horse, holding a gun in his hand, whatever, I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
We've had enough of those, you think?
Well, we may be at about its limit.
So I guess we're going to sort of begin to edge into the end of this this fascinating conversation. I thank you for it. Any closing remarks to lead us out? And I guess within that, I'm curious as to what you are working on next. What's the next project?
I wish I could tell you for sure. This is my 8th book. I'm fascinated with a lot of things. I lived for many, many years in the Caribbean, in the Virgin Islands. And I've been very interested in Governor von Scholten, who was the governor in the Virgin Islands in 1848 when it was a Danish colony, who freed the slaves. And it's a fascinating story behind him. He got in big trouble for that too, by the way. And I was in Ethiopia for a few years with the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. And when I was there, I got very interested in Ethiopian history, and have collected a lot of materials, and have thought about maybe doing a biography of King Theodros, who was, if you ever get into Ethiopian history, I can tell you all about that. I'm really interested, as you can probably tell from that, in looking at people more than battle studies. I think I've had my fill in battle studies. I've done a lot of those, and I guess I think I'm going to stay in the biography realm for a while. I'm not sure exactly what my next one's going to be about, though. Like I say, there's several people out there. Alan Pinkerton is another one I'm very interested in. I'm taking a look at a lot of material on him, and there's a lot of fascinating areas there as well.
Absolutely.
So
Wonderful.
I'm not
Well,
sure,
Gordon,
but it'll be something I can't seem to stop.
yeah. Well, I want to thank you for a wonderful book and a dynamite conversation. Again, everyone should go out and get this book, buy this book. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you,
Hey.
Kevin. Appreciate
And I
it.
wanted to thank both of you for a wonderful conversation, and also thank our audience. And I would just let our audience know that there is a 40% discount on this book. So not only is it worth your money, but you can get it for even less money than the ticket price through LSU Press. And the information on that is up on the screen now. So I would like to thank everyone again for joining us, and thank you, Gordon and Kevin, for a great talk. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.